If you think that current AI algorithms are wrong for artificial general intelligence, you might be right. In this video, I spoke with Karl Friston. Karl is one of the greatest and the most cited neuroscientists in history. We discussed the nature of consciousness, what is natural intelligence, how we can potentially build artificial general intelligence, and why it's extremely dangerous to deploy autonomous AI systems that have no concept of consequences for their own actions. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. Thanks for watching.
When you move into the world of things that act on the basis of decision making, then you have to ask, what is the definition of an authentic agent? And as soon as you ask that, then there are deep questions about the motivation and the intentions of that agency. And the problem with current AI, and I'm sort of talking about generative AI based upon sort of transformer architectures or large language models, is that there is no agency. It's a facsimile of agency in the sense that agency would require a system to have a generative model or a world model of the consequences of its actions. And
I understand your argument, but even with the current AI systems, there's still lots of uncertainty. As I understand, the tension between military and those frontier AI labs is that even with the current AI systems, even if we apply your logic that they're not autonomous, they don't have full agency, but there's still lots of uncertainty in their behavior if there's no safeguards.
Oh no, absolutely. I was, agree entirely with that argument. That's why I use the example of sending children into the battlefield, for example. You don't know how they're going to behave. Giving a child a gun is not a good idea because you just don't know what the consequences of that kind of agent will be. So, but I would submit that the problem is even deeper than that. It's not just the uncertainty and the relaxation of any safeguards. Even the people putting safeguards in place do not understand what they are safeguarding against, because there is no explainable intention or motivation behind the decisions or actions that a large language model would make. That's because it does not have a natural intelligence, and specifically, it doesn't have a world model of the consequences of its actions. And if it doesn't have a world model of the consequences of its actions, it cannot evaluate whether to commit to an action or not. It cannot choose or select the best thing to do now in relation to what it has been taught to do or what the value function that you have specified in terms of its preferred, the outcomes that it prefers to achieve through action. So I think it's even more dangerous than just being uncertain about what they will do. I think it is more dangerous in the sense that it is unknowable what they will do because they themselves do not know why they are doing it.
Do you think it's possible to speculate and we can, it's not claims, but we can speculate about this because it's very important topic. It's something that really impacts, humanity. If those safeguards for some reason will be lifted, let's say in this argument, military wins and those safeguards will be lifted, what consequences that might have for the world or for humans? Would it be possible to sort of speculate on this?
Yes, I could read your face, and I know I can imagine that you'll be able to answer much more catastrophically and entertainingly than I can. But the obvious things, which you and I have both heard on the news in the past 24 hours, is all sorts of catastrophes. The obvious one, of course, is initiating a nuclear war, misidentifying targets, acting in a way which goes right back to the paperclip paradox. If you don't know why something is behaving in a particular way, if you don't have an understanding of the mechanics of intentional behavior, and indeed if there are no intentions that specifically in relation to, say, large language models, all they're predicting is the next word. They're not predicting the consequences of saying that word or switching off somebody's email or doing something. The opportunities for a catastrophic outcome in the context of a military deployment, defensive or offensive, are almost unimaginable and possibly uncountable.
I hope that people who are making these crucial decisions, they will understand that, and we will not get to the point to test those theories in reality. To your point about that about the true agency of AI systems, what I see right now, frontier AI labs like claiming that they're on the path to artificial general intelligence, what they call minimal AGI. So as I understand that, what it means is that AI covers most of cognitive tasks that average human performs. And the claim is that we will get there in 2 years, approximately in 2 years from now. And in the next 5 to 10 years, we will have super intelligence AI that exceeds all humans, right? Like in terms of their cognitive capabilities in basically almost all the domains. And at the same time, there is another dynamic happening in the research world. There are lots of so-called neo labs start forming. And actually recently there was a list, there's at least 50 neo labs. It's companies who raised hundreds of millions of dollars at a seed or series A. And their founders are, prominent AI researchers, for example, David Silver or Ilya Satskover. And it seems like they taking different approach, at least they're trying in their research work, different approaches to get to true AGI or super intelligence. So I'm just wondering, what is your take on this? Do you think when AI, frontier AI labs claiming that we will get to minimal AGI in a few years from now, that it's not just, PR stunt, but it's genuine claim, considering the current trajectory of AI systems? And why do you think all those prominent researchers starting the new companies claiming that actually there's different ways to achieve AGI?
I'm going to answer from the perspective of a commitment to natural intelligence as the best kind of generalized intelligence. So if people mean by generalized artificial intelligence that which is bimemetic, that which reproduces the kind of sentience and decision-making and planning that we enjoy, which is incredibly context-sensitive and very situationally aware, then I think it's highly unlikely that the current frontier direction of travel predicated on generative AI, and in particular on reinforcement technology, will ever achieve that. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Most of the people I speak to, most of the thought leaders I speak to in this space, are very skeptical that just throwing more and more money and electricity and hardware at, say, transformer architectures is ever going to realize the kind of natural intelligence or the aspects of natural intelligence that would qualify something as having a general intelligence. And I mean that both in terms of data mining and sort of processing data, but also in an embodied and situated context in terms of drones and autonomous vehicle research, for example. And perhaps we should just look at the autonomous vehicle, the history of autonomous vehicle. I mean, I can remember being promised that self-driving cars are going to be here next year for the past 2 decades. It just hasn't happened.
I mean, in San Francisco, Waymo's everywhere. It's almost, you're driving and you see you're surrounded by Waymo cars that are driving autonomously. Now they're actually also started driving not only in San Francisco, but also beyond, in South Bay. I understand there's a limited deployment. It's not that they're, covered the entire world, but at least when it comes to San Francisco Bay Area, we do see autonomous vehicles on a daily.
Right. So my colleagues sent me a video of their first drive from the airport in San Francisco. Yeah, absolutely amazing. So my point was, though, that the promise of the next 2 years, I think, is optimistic, even in the in the context of autonomous vehicles, in terms of them being deployed universally. Certainly, I haven't seen one in the UK, although there are instances where very controlled situations. I just bring that up just in reference to your previous conversation. If you can engineer something that is very, very specific in terms of the ways in which it can go wrong, then I think you can safeguard it. So an autonomous vehicle is engineered to be extremely predictable and has a very, very limited autonomy and agency that is extremely well defined. But it has taken decades to get there. I think the question about should AI be given to the Department of War could be sort of, well, would you trust the current tech behind autonomous vehicles, for example? I mean, I think you possibly could, because that's been beautifully engineered in a very limited domain for many, well, for decades now. Would that apply to humanoid robots? I suspect not. And certainly would not apply to sort of decision making, in a non-embodied context. But I've got a bit distracted. To come back to your question, I was still worrying about your first question, which is a really important question. Coming to the question about the time frame, I think that the most people I speak to certainly very skeptical that generative AI, as we currently know it, that has been engineered, beautifully engineered, using reinforcement learning, is not the right direction of travel. The right direction of travel is, I repeat, towards natural intelligence and biomimetic principles. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the fundamental biomimetic principles that make me intelligent and make you intelligent? I think the first thing that you pick up on is the importance of having a generative model and an explainable world model under the technology. The second thing that you pick up on, which is by definition provides an explanation and a calculus and an understanding of not only how it makes sense of the data that it is mining or that it is supplied, but also allows you, very much in the spirit of the previous exchange, allows you to see whether it's got a generative model of the future and can therefore plan. So to put it very, very simply, the difference between most AI that I know about, a true AGI, would be the ability to plan. So as soon as you've got a world model that entails the consequences of your actions, you can now evaluate the outcomes of your actions in the future. So immediately we're now talking about world models or generative models that are future pointing, and furthermore provide a number of different counterfactual features. And as soon as that happens, you've now got to select, and you have to select this path forward or this path forward or this path forward. That selection is now going to equip this kind of intelligence with true agency, in the sense that it will have intentions, because the intended outcome is defined by the particular decision it makes, or the plan or the policy it selects in a very active way. So this is a world away from current neural network and deep RL research, begs the question now: what underwrites the selection of this decision or this choice or this plan or this policy? And then you get into deep questions about what is the value function, what is motivating the choice of the decision. And that motivation, of course, is usually sort of ignored because you just write down a value function. But that's not good enough for general intelligence. It's not good enough to describe the behavior of things like you and me. So there's a whole argument there, not just about the necessity for generative models, but also the role of value learning or reinforcement learning in defining the goals that determine how to select your particular future, where you are the artifact that's meant to be intelligent.
But what is inherently wrong with current reinforcement learning approach? Because the agents still they're making decisions, they're still they're deciding on strategies. So what is inherently wrong with deep RL?
I think that question would be best answered by asking what would be the right way, what is the right objective function? I could answer trivially and say what is wrong with deep RL is that it is predicated on a value function. No one has solved the value function selection problem. So I ask you, what would be the value function that you would want for your children? Would it be to get the maximum number of likes? Would it be to make money? Would it be to maintain a body temperature of 37 degrees?
While I'm responsible for them, it's just unsure that unsure their survival. But once they're adults, I guess they will define their own value function. They can do whatever they want with their lives, and I don't think I will have control over it.
That was an excellent answer, and I think in that answer is basically what I was trying to say. So you mentioned survival, and you mentioned they will learn their own value functions. That tells you immediately that if survival is the ultimate objective function, and they are selecting their own value functions, that means you cannot prescribe, you cannot give an intelligent artifact a value function. You have to give it the capacity to learn the right value function for itself. And then you have to think carefully, what is that value function? I think you answered that by saying to survive, to persist, to be sustainable, to endure over time. And if you take an evolutionary, again, a sort of natural science as opposed to sort of machine learning approach, then you sort of end up with a very specific objective function, a universal objective function, which is just a measure of the survivability or the sustainability of this agent immersed in its eco-niche, immersed in its data world, immersed in its environment, however you want to sort of think about these things. So how would you then measure survivability? And then you get to, well, yes, you were about to answer. How would you measure it?
So how you would measure if system has this property of survivability?
Yeah, that would be the ultimate, that would be the right value function.
Several months ago, Anthropic had this experiment, but they designed it like it was artificial environment. They designed that, basically like a system has like certain instructions. When that system received contradicting instructions, it still continued following the initial instructions. And when it was there was a risk that it could shut down, it started behaving, like basically opting to like different strategies to not be shut down. Like it started like blackmailing, trying to find like all these different ways to make sure that it can continue following its initial instructions and it won't be shut down. So even though it was sort of artificially designed experiment, but it seems that even with the current AI systems, the current AI still like shows some signs, right, that it wants to survive, like that's some signs of this survivability. Do you think, is it enough of argument for you that even with the current AI systems we can go very, very far?
No. If by the current AI systems you mean something where another user specifies the value function or the loss function or the reward function, because that violates your response, your children will find their own value functions. There are about three arguments one could bring to the table to say, no, that's not a compelling argument. One of them is the relationship of the artifact to the world in which it finds itself. So there is no universal value function or objective function or reward that is apt for everything that this agent might experience, and in particular in relation to the environment or say the user that it finds himself it finds itself relating to. One would argue from a sort of natural sciences perspective, if we're talking about adaptive fitness, basically. We're talking the survivability. So if you went to theoretical biology and evolutionary thinking, what you're talking about now is the ultimate objective function, the ultimate survival function, the ultimate measure of this thing's sustainability in the setting in which it finds itself, which it will have to learn, is adaptive fitness. You just described an interesting experiment where presumably a large language model was
there are like multiple language models actually from most of frontier labs. They tested most of them, and most of them showed this behavior that they want to survive. They don't want to shut down.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we could talk about that. Wanting to survive, to want something is to actually have a world model of the future, but these machines don't have a world model of the future. So what that means is they are producing words that are being interpreted by an intelligent user as wanting something. And that suggests that the material that they have ingested and been trained upon is a reflection of a species that wants. So I would challenge the notion that these machines actually want anything. To want something is to have a goal in mind, and the goal determines what you do. But to have that, you have to have a world model of the consequences of doing something. But let's just come back to the adaptive fitness, because there is a way of writing down mathematically a value function that is the adaptive fitness. But the key point about adaptive fitness is that it is adaptive fit to the ecosystem or the user or the network of users within, or for example, the road that an autonomous, or the kind of road that an autonomous vehicle would drive down. So for every particular domain of application or every context in which you could find AGI, you'll have to ask, how well is this AGI fit to the situation in which it finds itself? And mathematically, that measure of fit is literally very much like a marginal likelihood.
Do I understand correctly that basically what you're saying, in the current AI systems, it's because there's a prompt, user or developer gives a prompt to AI, like it's prompting it to wanting to survive. That's why we can't count it's genuine desire of AI system to survive. It's just because it was prompted. But in real AGI that follows your vision, that motivation to survive, it's something like inherited, something that when humans born, they don't understand anything about the world, but they have this already built-in mechanism to survive, right? Like babies crying, or like some exposing different behavior, like to attract attention, again ensuring its survivability. But it's something like baby doesn't understand this. It's something we can argue that baby also was prompted wanting to survive, but it was prompted by what? Evolution, let's say, right? So basically, like argument, can we make the same analogy that the current AI systems also were prompted to survive by their creators?
That's very clever. And notice that we've come back to evolution as the the foundational way in which things evolve to be adaptively fit and to fit into their environment and to fit together. Sometimes denoted or talked about in terms of ecosystems of intelligence, or mixtures, ecosystems of artificial and natural intelligences evolving together, co-constructing their environment, where the objective function just is adaptive fitness. And you're absolutely right that a lot of this rests upon one could regard as prompts by natural selection, but that's not the complete story. Just think about what you did as a little baby in order to adaptively fit your world and to learn about your world, and indeed to learn about your value functions and your preferences. There's something fundamentally different about simply instructing something to survive and equipping it with the ability to build a generative model of its lived world that enables it to survive. And in fact, the two are the same. So if you have a good generative model of your world, then you are now a good fit to that world. And therefore you have adaptive fitness. You have adapted to fit this particular world. So mathematically, that objective function, I repeat, is a marginal likelihood. From an evolutionary perspective, you could say it's the likelihood of finding this particular artifact or this phenotype or this child in this culture, in this ecosystem or this eco-niche. That marginal likelihood just is the model evidence, the probability of all the sensory or data that this agent solicits or harvests or gathers, given its model of the world. So what I'm arguing to hit towards here is the right objective function is simply the marginal likelihood or the model evidence for a generative model given a data exchange with the environment. And crucially, because we're talking about agents now, the agent is in charge of gathering the data. So the agent will just make those choices and be an agent and make those choices that enable it to gather the data, that enables it to maximize the evidence for its world model. I keep sort of talking about world models and generative models deliberately, because of course this is the argument people like Jan LeCun bring to the table, and I would certainly be in that camp. And I'm just wondering, when you were talking about some of these new laboratories, perhaps that's what they mean by another way forward. That to actually move away from unexplainable, and we haven't even talked about efficiency at this stage, but inefficient, large models, and towards much more efficient, small, biomimetic generative models. So as soon as you've got a generative model as part of your calculus, as part of your sort of frame of intelligence, then you can now quantify the evidence for that model literally in terms of the probability of these data that can be actively gathered, conditioned on or under that particular generative model. That's the right objective function.
Basically, you're saying that agent in real time interacts with the environment, collects that data, but what makes it right objective function? What it basically, as we discussed, like objective function is ensure your survivability, but where like that emergence of that objective function will come to that agent, if not it sort of something inherited, not something that its creators, like developers, implemented into that agent?
To answer that question, one has to think about how do you maximize the evidence for your model, or in other words, how do you act in a way to make all your exchanges with your world or your user or your parents as likely as possible. That's all that maximizing the adaptive fitness or the marginal likelihood of the model evidence means. What you will have to do is to actively gather those data that resolve your uncertainty or maximize the information gain in relation to your model. That basically means that you can explain, in fact, in the physics backstory to the argument I'm trying to unpack here in response to your question. It is provably the case that any sustainable self-organizing system that satisfies certain criteria, and those criteria are effectively that it can actually represent the consequences of its actions, sometimes known as planning as inference, then it will be the case that in order to maximize the adaptive fitness or maximize the evidence for your model, you're going to take those actions that minimize your uncertainty about the world in which you're behaving. And what that looks like is that you have a drive to be curious, that you're driven to do those things that have the greatest information gain that resolves the uncertainty under your generative model. So to come back to your example about the baby, it is certainly the case that the baby will behave in a way to elicit responses from the mother that are epigenetically encoded, and these would be sort of endowed by evolution. But that's only a small part of its behavior. Most of its behavior is actually exploratory. Most of its behavior is actually to try and learn about the cause-effect structure in its world, right from sort of getting mum's attention, simply down to, what I can move stuff. What can I move? And you get into wonderful paradigms like the baby mobile paradigm. Why do babies love to pull and manipulate their mobiles or their rattles? Simply because it provides evidence for the fact that they can change that, but they can't change other things. They can't make mum suddenly appear, but they can certainly make the rattle make a noise. It takes a month to learn this, and so the objective function here is to act in a way that minimizes your uncertainty or maximizes minimizes your uncertainty about your generative model. So this has many names. It's called intrinsic motivation in robotics. It's called, in my world, it would be sometimes referred to as intrinsic value, epistemic affordance. In empowerment, it is related to empowerment indirectly. It's also known as expected information gain. In statistics, this is the fundamental principle of optimum Bayesian experimental design. So that's a really important part of the objective function, which is largely completely missing in deep RL.
You have to have this intrinsic objective to survive in order to explore and have that curiosity to explore the world, to minimize uncertainty.
You sort of summarize that because you mentioned curiosity. I think that's a really key thing. I think to have AGI, you'll know when AGI is here when your chatbot starts to become curious. So when it's genuinely curious about you and starts prompting you to reveal information.
Not I'm prompting the conversation, but it starts prompting me.
Exactly.
To learn more about me.
Yeah. That's right.
Where, like in artificial intelligence, that intrinsic objective function can evolve. That's not clear to me. Is it coming from developer, or it's some like emerging behavior that we might see at some point?
Well, in the natural sciences, it's just emergent behavior. It's almost a tautological description of systems that emerge through a process of selection, because if they don't have that adaptive fitness, if they don't model their lived world, they will not survive. So it's a very deflationary tautological kind of emergence. It's if things are present in the world, it means that they have already adapted to that world and have adapted fitness, and therefore have a high marginal likelihood of being there. So this is a statement of natural selection. You could also argue it from the point of view of cybernetics. So there's the good regulator theorem from the first half of the 20th century, then led on to things like the law of requisite variety. I think that the notion of the good regulator theorem is quite useful here. What it says is to survive, to endure, to be in a persistent way part of your controllable environment is to be a good model of that environment. And then the law of requisite variety says then the degrees of freedom that you have on the inside in modeling the way that you control that environment has to match the degrees of freedom on the outside of the environment that can be controlled. So these are just emergent properties in the natural sciences. In statistics, you can actually write down the objective function and then use fixed point iteration or gradient descent. If you could even actually use backpropagation of errors. So the most beautiful example of that is a variational autoencoder. So a variational autoencoder uses backpropagation of errors with an objective function called the ELBO, the evidence lower bound. The evidence that is bounded by the objective function in a variational autoencoder is exactly the quantity that I'm talking about.
Even with the current algorithm and current tooling we have, it's possible to design those experiments in which we can ensure this sort of like selection, right? It's a selection of algorithms that can evolve and have that intrinsic survival behavior.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's basically the other direction that you were talking about before. I think it's building curiosity. It's actually putting curiosity as the real value function into machine learning. But before we sort of bring that conclusion to any closure, you're absolutely right. They're under constraints. So, we start off by talking about guardrails. So this is not just about writing curiosity in terms of expected information gain or intrinsic motivation. It has to be constrained, very much in the mathematical spirit of James's maximum entry principle. There are always constraints. It's not just maximize entropy under constraints. And those constraints are exactly what you were talking about before. The constraints are the guardrails, so that it precludes me being curious to the extent that I encounter something that is damaging or extremely surprising. So a baby may be curious about what would happen if I jump over this cliff. But interestingly, they are equipped with certain innate priors, first priors, some people call them, by epigenetics and evolution, to find some things aversive. So certain curious behaviors they will find aversive. And I think this is exactly the guardrails that you were talking about before.
If you had billions of dollars, like any resources you need, what kind of experiments and research would you conduct to find, to basically give a rise to this kind of agents with the curiosity and intrinsic survivability feature?
I think that they would actually be somewhat reminiscent of the experiment you described before, where you sort of change the context and sort of try to encourage sustainable activity in a way that is much more like artificial life studies. So I think what you would need to do to, if you like, develop AGI in the way that we've been talking about, you would basically have to ensure that you are not using reward learning and a value function that you have specified. All you need to do is to ensure that this agent is equipped with curiosity, so the value function now becomes the expected information gain with constraints, and those constraints are basically don't go there. Don't go there in the sense that it has to know the kind of thing that it is. So a baby knows that it has a certain temperature, and therefore it has built in certain prior preferences or innate expressions of surprise. That means it knows when it is in a very uncharacteristic state that is not compatible with the kind of thing it is, such as being very, very cold or very, very hot or damaged in some way. So you have to equip the agent with a specification of the kind of thing that it is. That's the constraint part of this expected information gain. In my world, that would be written down as an expected utility or expected value in the same spirit as a reward, but it's multidimensional. It basically provides a constraint over all the outcomes that could be encountered, and that constraint says this narrow subset is consistent with you being the kind of thing that you are. If you find yourself outside that, you have stopped being the kind of thing you are. You're a dead thing, you're a broken thing, you are any way in which you can violate those safeguards, where the safeguards now are just a specification of the kind of agent it is. So if you can write down, if in answer to your question, what kind of experiment would one envisage, you'd basically be doing artificial life, but with real embodied agents who are all striving to get to know each other because they all want to maximize their adaptive fitness by being curious about each other. So you're talking now very much like a sort of neurorobotic setup with beyond dialectic interactions with multiple agents. It could all be in silico. It may not necessarily need to be embodied, but there would certainly have to be a sort of consequence to actually moving and changing the world, so that each AGI could act upon the other AGI. And crucially, to make this meaningful for you and me, we would have to be, or a human would have to be part of this artificial life. It would have to be part of this ecosystem, because what you're looking for is that the baby AGIs are going to be curious about you, and they're going to learn from you. So you will literally become a parent in this kind of experiment. And then if you get that right, then you should see the kind of emergent behavior. But it will be very much like bringing up a child. It can be no other way, in the sense that the most efficient way of doing this has been found by evolution.
How I provide my input to that baby AGI, this is what I'm not clear yet. So like, for example, there is like imitation learning in robotics, when humans conduct like the same task and like collect maybe like 50 samples, or like, I don't know how many samples, conducting the same thing, and they teach robots, and there's very like good progress right now. But it seems it's not imitation learning per se. It's more depth. What you're describing is like, it seems it's a daily, like constant interaction of human and baby AGI, from which they sort of create this reinforcement loop to some extent. I'm just trying to envision on a sort of like practical level how, what form it could take, how I can provide input to my baby AGI so it adapts to, to my world, and like it grows like aligned with my values.
If you can answer that question, you can then go and do the $1 billion.
We can go like raise money, right?
I think if you look at neurorobotics, you probably get the closest answer to it, because I mean, for many years now, they've been focusing on dyadic interactions between robots and how they come to learn each other, even to the extent of sort of using that as a test bed to understand human interpersonal interactions, and even, for example, difficulties with people with autism, for example. That would be a very fecund, rich experimental space to actually have lots of little robots all working together, and with a human in the loop, to see how they start to self-organize. But you don't have to worry. The beauty of this is you don't have to worry about instilling or installing or prescribing your baby artificial intelligence with the right kind of information, because the whole point about having the expected information gain, having the artificial curiosity as part of the objective function, is that it will ask for the information it knows it needs in order to reduce its uncertainty. So the expected information gain, a fundamental and entertaining point, that the information that I gain from doing that, from subscribing to this social media or watching this kind of news channel, or engaging conversation with somebody like you, these are deliberate acts that I know I'm going to learn something. But what I learn and what I know depends upon what I already knew. So I can only resolve my uncertainty, i.e. engage in soliciting high information content, if I'm uncertain. So, and of course, once I've done that ceases to be novel. So I won't do that again. I'll go somewhere else to get some more information that shrinks my uncertainty. From moment to moment, from artifact to artifact, the primary, or one of the most important motivations for intentional behavior changes as you do your belief updating. And I'm using belief updating now in a sort of Bayesian sense, which is one way of reading the inversion of these generative models. You don't have to worry about how you would tell it. It will sort of poke you in a way that resolves itself. So the first thing it's going to do, in terms of a baby AGI that actually has some motor plant, and we've seen this in the history of robotics and machine learning. The first thing it's going to do is going to flail around to work out what it can change and what it can't change. And then it's going to get interested in you if you start to provide unexplainable sensory cues by moving in a way that is not the same as everything else it's seen move, which would be, for example, stationary artifacts. And then it's going to try and learn and build a generative model of you as an intentional artifact. And after a period of time, and probably I repeat, the same time scales it would to bring up a baby, you will start to not teach, but certainly provide an opportunity to learn. I mean, just think about what we do with our children. We keep them safe. This is a safeguarding with constraints. But as soon as we've established that they are safe, we send them off to school. We just provide them with an opportunity to learn. If you've got the right objective function, then this should all be emergent behavior. And some people would argue this is the only route to general intelligence of the kind that you and I would recognize. And in the recognition, of course, there is the presupposition that there is a sufficient common ground between your AGI and you to be able to recognize behaviors and intentions in that AGI, which tells you immediately there has to be a sufficient overlap between its generative model and your generative model. Otherwise, it's just an artifact, and it doesn't. It's a tool. Well, in the context of large language models, it's a universal function approximator, creating really interesting stuff that we interpret, but it's not what has been generated is something that we have given it because it's mined all the things that we have generated.
When you're talking about, minimizing uncertainty, and what I notice, at least in my behavior, and I guess like many humans have this, if I schedule a meeting, I know for sure, most likely, I will be late because I'm always late for meetings. But every time I schedule a meeting, I have like firm belief that like this time I will come on time. And I'm like, they're like, you can, basically create a bunch of these examples when you already know, when you already gathered information, when you already like removed that surprise, but you still have firm belief that it will be different this time. Can you explain from neuroscience perspective what is the property of human behavior that prompts this? Already like know the outcome, but you still have firm belief that this time will be different.
The closest thing that comes to mind is one's optimism bias. You can read an optimism bias that this time I'm going to be on time. Until you're late. But before you're actually late, of course, you believe you are going to be on time. And you may ask, well, is that optimism bias? Is the bias?
Basically, we keep repeating our mistakes. Even we know like doing something will result in a mistake because we did that mistake in the past. Not necessarily we learn from that mistake. Through our behavior, we tend to repeat mistakes.
Well, I mean, that's a really important observation. So if you take this understanding of sentient behavior, this sort of formalism that we've been talking about, ranging from variational autoencoders to artificial curiosity of the kind that, say, people like Jürgen Schmidhuber have been talking about for many years. In my world, that's known as active inference. And just technically, before I forget, the expected information gain plus the expected or minus the expected constraints or cost is expected free energy. And the free energy is a negative elbow that you find in variational. It's a variation of free energy. There's a formal mathematical link between all of these things. The important, the reason I make that clear is that that variational free energy and the expected free energy as bounds upon model evidence provide you a link to an understanding of intelligence in terms of Bayesian model evidence, of Bayesian model selection, and Bayesian belief updating. And that, I think, is important just to understand optimism bias, but also you brought really important another perspective or angle to the table, which is what happens when it goes wrong. So I use these, and many of my colleagues do in academia, use this formalism to understand psychopathology and psychiatric disorders. When you get stuck in a rut, say addictive behavior, for example, social withdrawal. Let's just say you have had a very adverse, traumatizing social interaction, and that was very surprising. It was something uncharacteristic of the kind of experiences something like me would ever expect. And therefore, I am not going to put myself out there because that kind of behavior, that kind of policy will lead to a high expected cost or a high expected surprise, or it violates some of these safety guardrails that we were talking about before. And in so doing, I now prevent myself from gathering any evidence that perhaps not all social interactions are aversive and traumatic. So I will never know that. So I now get trapped in a particular behavior of social withdrawal, simply because that's completely base optimal. It's avoiding the... perhaps I should just clarify formally the link here. So this expected free energy that comprises the expected information gain and the expected cost speaks to the dual aspects of Bayes optimality. So you can get the principle of optimal Bayesian design, which is designing an experiment that maximizes the information gain you get from the data if you perform that experiment. But there's another kind of Bayes optimality due to Bayesian decision theory. And Bayesian decision theory rests on something called a cost function, which is a negative reward function. So this is the surprise or constraint satisfying part of it. So the two together, give you a complement, have both aspects of Bayes optimality in play. But if you're avoiding the surprise or the cost from the Bayesian decision theoretic optimal point of view, you're compromising the optimal Bayesian design point of view. You're compromising your curiosity. So you never get to learn that, in fact, it's okay to relate to most people. Most people are actually quite nurturing, quite supportive, and you will have a familiar, comfortable interaction without any surprises, but you won't know that. So I think it's really important that sort of you brought that to the table. And I'm not saying that you have a psychopathology, but you're always being late when you intend. And this time I'm going to be on time. I think is, if you like, a sort of benign example of that. You now have a self model. You have prior beliefs about the kind of thing you are, and you are an endearingly bright thing that is always slightly late and rushed. You are, and therefore you fulfill your own expectations, because remember, we're always acting in a way to minimize uncertainty or minimize expected surprise. So if you act in a way that surprises yourself, you're not going to do that. So if you suddenly find yourself being early and you're not the kind of person who's early, you'll surprise yourself. You're going to avoid that. So this is optimism.
That's why I'm coming late, so to minimize the surprise. I'm wondering this kind of behavior, and it's not only about this particular example, like in every aspect of our life, right? We're developing certain behaviors throughout life, and we sort of stuck in that behavior, right? Is it because we inherently want to minimize surprise, and once we have this familiar pattern of behavior, to some extent it contradicts to curiosity aspect, right? Is it's always sort of back and forth, like the kind of balance between having familiar pattern to minimize surprise versus keep having that curiosity to ensure survivability.
From a sort of natural science perspective, from a mathematical perspective, the expected information gain that underwrites the curiosity and novelty seeking has the same units as the expected cost when you write down the cost as basically a surprise, a negative log probability of being late, for example. And they are always in exact equal measure, given your preferences. But what happens over time is your uncertainty about your lived world or your particular environment or the particular context in which you find yourself, or if you've moved to a new house, for example, or a new city. Over time, you resolve your uncertainty. So over time, the epistemic part, the expected information gain part, starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller until the constraint, the expected cost part has a greater contribution to this admixture of expected information gain and expected value or negative expected cost. So what happens is, quite naturally and deterministically, when you move to a new situation or enter a new relationship or indeed wake up to a new day, then you will resolve your epistemic uncertainty. You respond to these epistemic affordances by being curious until such time as there is no more reducible uncertainty, and then you will just become exploitative. So this is sometimes in the behavioral literature, behavioral psychology, refer to in terms of an explore-exploit dilemma. In my world, in active inference, there is no dilemma. It's just you start off naive like a baby. Most of your behavior is purely epistemic information gathering until such time as there is no more uncertainty to resolve, and then you just do the kind of things that you do, which are your constraints. So, don't surprise yourself.
But then you get bored,
Precisely.
most likely, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not a bad kind of boredom though. So it's interesting to think about what boredom means. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So just coming back to your example of the baby, that process by which you get sort of stuck in your ways and you stop being novelty seeking and curious, that's what you see as you get older. So yes, there is a natural rhythm to this. There is a natural time course to this. So you start off being very exploratory, very curious, learn a lot. And by the time you get to my age, you don't go bungee jumping, don't go to discos. You just have a very rigid daily routine where everything is as unsurprising and predictable as possible.
Why is that? Like, is it also from evolutionary standpoint, it's justified somehow? Since
I think you could certainly look at it from an evolutionary perspective. In so doing, it allows me just to sort of come back to one of your earlier points that, no man stands in the same river twice. So the world that I am trying to adapt to is constantly changing. So there's always some epistemic affordance there. There's always a drive to resolve my uncertainty. In the visual search literature, in the neurosciences and the visual sciences, this is known as Bayesian surprise. This is not just surprise or the implausibility of something happening. It's a very specific kind of surprise. We seek out Bayesian surprise. We seek out the opportunity for that expected information gain. And that's constant. But of course, if you can construct your niche and you can become to know your AGI, or you come to know your parents, or as you get older, you have a shrinking but more consistent group of close friends, for example, then the uncertainty, the need to respond by exploratory processes, policies, becomes less and less until, for example, one of your close friends, one of your loved ones dies. And then you've got to explore again. And then you have to go through a grief process. You have to re-engineer your world model. Your daily life is now completely different. So everything you predicted is just not now relevant because that loved one is just not part of your daily life anymore. So that can take years to sort of readjust. So it's not just a monotonic decline from exploration to exploitation. There is a certain itinerancy during that period. And one could argue that is why we have to die. That is why we have a life cycle. Because the environment that we started off by talking about is always changing. So now that we need to repopulate this environment with things
with
that
new curious minds.
Exactly. And that's why we have children.
Can I ask a very dumb question, considering that I'm talking to like father of neuroscience? With all the tooling available, why we still struggle to understand how human brain works?
Well, we could get on to consciousness research. Perhaps the simplest answer is to understand how the human brain works in a philosophical sense would be basically, can I infer or measure my own brain? And of course you can't in the same sense that a ruler cannot measure itself. So there's a certain Gödelesque impossibility, a self-referential impossibility to ever understand ourselves. We can get quite close in terms of understanding other people. I can understand you, and I can have a world model of you inside my head, but I can never actually understand me. In the same.
So basically, if we interact long enough, then your model of me will be more precise than your model of yourself.
It will hopefully it will converge. Yes, but you're absolutely right. Hopefully, we would converge on a shared model, what Tomaselli would call a common ground, which would just be the same generative model. So that would be a philosophical answer. The other answer is, why is it so difficult?
What is scientific answer?
Well, the scientific answer is quite interesting. It's just that in order for you to have a model of the world and to persist as something that can be individuated or disambiguated from that world, you have to have a boundary that demarcates you from the rest of the world. If that boundary went away, you would decay, die, dissipate, dissolve. You would dissolve and dissipate into the environment. There'd be no distinction between you and the rest of the environment. So the very notion, which is interesting where we started, about survive, the only measure of goodness, the only true reward function is just survival. Survival basically means the maintenance of the distinction between you and the environment. Mechanistically, or from the point of view of physics, that boundary, in my world that's called a Markov blanket, means that someone on the outside will never actually know what's going on the inside. If I wanted to directly access the inside to understand and measure the brain, I'd have to breach that blanket. And we do that. We do that occasionally with, say, neurosurgery or neuropsychology based upon penetrating injuries to the brain. So there are opportunities to look at a breached brain and work out what functionality is lost and try to infer what that lost machinery was. But in the intact brain, we're always trying to peep behind this Markov blanket, this shroud, using neuroimaging or electrophysiology or psychophysics and psychology. So you can't actually get inside somebody's head and work out what's going on. So we're still taking baby steps in understanding the functional computational architectures, the functional anatomy, the neurochemistry of how our brains work. And that's why it's such a fascinating area. Made very, very challenging, because unlike, well, perhaps not, a little bit like sort of astrophysics or deep sea, you can't actually measure it very easily. But there's a fundamental reason why you can't measure the brain. It's just that the brain, by definition, only exists as long as it has its Markov blanket that separates it from all the experimenters or family that are interacting with that brain.
Just for people who will be watching this, can you elaborate what is Markov blanket is?
So that's a terminology that is central to the physics backstory to this active inference formulation of evidence gathering. In philosophy, some people call this self-evidencing. So what we're talking about in terms of AGI, gathering evidence for its world models, is sometimes referred to as self-evidencing. A special kind of self-organization in physics, which tries to minimize the surprise, which is known as the self-information in information theory. So there's lots of ways in which the self emerges, both from the point of view of philosophy, from the point of view of artificial intelligence research, but also from physics. So we're talking about the physics of self-organization. So the first thing you have to do is define what you mean by a self in self-organization. And you can either ignore the fact that there is part of the universe that is not the self, and then you can do 20th century physics, and that's the physics of closed systems. So you just assume that the self is an idealized gas, for example. So you're not worried about the system being open to an environment, then you can get equilibrium physics out of it. Or you can move to 21st century physics, where now there's the self and then there's a non-self. And that means that the self is open to the non-self, the rest of the universe, the environment, the heat bath, however you want to think about it. And then you get into the physics of non-equilibrium steady states, and you get into the breaking. There's all sorts of interesting aspects to this kind of physics of self-organization. But the key point, the key thing is that you have to be able to separate self from non-self. So how do you do that? Well, it's difficult to do because on the one hand, you want something like a barrier or a boundary, but the boundary has to be open, because you want to talk about open systems, the self-organization of open systems, to get this non-equilibrium physics, far from equilibrium physics, in play, to understand the itinerant dynamics that we've been talking about in terms of learning and life cycles and exploration, exploitation, and ultimately self-evidencing. So the way that that's done is basically to split all the states in the universe into states on the inside, say my brain, and states on the outside, say my body and extrapersonal space and the rest of the universe, and then a set of states that insulates and forms a boundary, and that set of states is known as a Markov blanket or a Markov boundary. Usually people split it into two. So the reason for that is if you want to have the system open, the self open to non-self, in this truly relational aspect that we were talking about before in relation to adaptive fitness, adapting to the outside, then you've got to have the inside influencing the outside through one set of states, usually known as active states, and then the outside influencing the inside through another set of states, usually called the sensory states. So you've now got this bi-directional exchange between the inside and the outside. But because the active states are not influenced by the outside and the sensory states are not influenced by the inside, there's now a separability, a probabilistic disambiguation or individuation of the self and the non-self. You can look at the statistics, you can look at the causal structure, if written down in terms of dynamical systems or differential equations, and say, yes, this is conditionally independent of that. The inside is conditionally independent of the outside. And that just means that if you wanted to know about how me, the self, would evolve in time, given the rest of the universe, I'd only need to know the blanket states. So that's where the Markov property comes in. So that's why it's called a Markov blanket. It's something that enshrouds you and shields you from the rest of the universe, all the states that may or may not be out there that are hidden behind the Markov blanket. So you'll often hear things like hidden states and latent states of machine learning. They are hidden because you don't have direct access to them, because they're hidden behind your Markov blanket. But at the same time, that blanket is open. It glues you to the world in the way that it's...
Yeah, because you are part of the system, right? You still belong to the system.
Absolutely.
Right? You can't fully separate yourself.
And that's exactly the notion of the system being open and engaged with this sort of bi-directional, absolutely. It's a term that was introduced by Judea Pearl in the context of graphical models and graphs. And actually, practically, it's a really useful concept, because in leaf updating and message passing computer science, you only need to sort of pass messages, communicate with your Markov blanket. You don't need to communicate with the rest of your CPU or your memories. It's just the Markov blanket that's important from each node's point of view. So it's a ubiquitous but really important foundation. It defines itself from a physicist's point of view. And once you've got a Markov blanket, you can then induce a Bayesian mechanics that just says it has to be the case that the dynamics on the inside and actually the active states, the things that we do to be an agent, can always be described as self-evidencing or minimizing this variation-free energy or maximizing the model evidence where we started, which is a measure of adaptive fitness.
Do you understand correctly that from your point of view, current AI systems, they don't have this Markov blanket?
I don't want to demean current. No, as I say, the variational autoencoder would be a lovely example of something that uses exactly this objective function and has exactly this Markov blanket. With the hidden layers, the deep layers, the bottleneck. These are representations of the causes on the outside that generated the input. The decoder. Is it the encoder? I always get that the way around. But no, that a variational autoencoder has exactly this kind of computational architecture.
Oh, okay. So it's true for variational autoencoders. If architecture doesn't have it, then what? It doesn't have Markov blanket?
I think anything that exists, including every computer, every algorithm running on a computer in the sense of mortal computation, can be said to have a Markov blanket. I think the question that you're implicitly asking is what cells, what things, suitably defined in terms of possessing a Markov blanket, would qualify as agents and autonomous. And that brings us back to where we started. If you now interpret the self-organization to a non-equilibrium steady state, also known as a pullback attractor, which is just the mathematical expression of non-surprising states that are, that the constraints are there to define, then you can show that the dynamics are effectively a gradient flow, a gradient descent on this negative elbow or variation free energy. And we've just said that the variation free energy, or the elbow, is a bound on the model evidence. So there's an implicit model under the hood. There's always an implicit generative model that is apt to describe the behavior of anything. We'll very, very seldom know what that model is. And indeed, one example of not knowing what that model is when you ask me, how do we understand the brain? We can't. It's behind the Markov blanket. But we know that it exists, or at least mathematically, there will be a generative model that explains the behavior of this thing. To be an agent, though, that generative model has to be of a special sort. It has to have a model of its own future, and in particular, its own future conditioned upon its action upon the world. To be an agent. The different kinds of natural things, the different sorts of natural kinds, inherit from what's on the inside, in playing the role of a generative model. And interesting, that usually means that you get this interesting agential-like behavior when and only when the inside, the deep inside, is disconnected from the actual outside Markov blanket. In other words, there are parts of your brain that don't have direct access to the movement of your muscles or your autonomic nervous system. So you cannot sense.
What directs those parts then? If my brain doesn't have access to it, so what directs those parts?
They're directed by predictions of what you expect to feel, and then reflexes, autonomic reflexes or motor reflex arcs make it come true. Just like in robotics, that you send a set point for a peripheral servo or a reflex arc. So physiologically, you'll have autonomic reflexes. So you predict the state of the world that you would find least surprising, or having the minimum free energy, or the maximum elbow, or the largest marginal likelihood. And then you let your body, your reflexes, make that come true. So this is exactly like you being late for every meeting. On the inside, you predict you're going to be late, and everything you physically do, all the buttons you press, all the buses you take, or all the cars you drive, make that come true. You're predicting yourself into existence, to use the phraseology of Andy Clark. So it's all about, and then you get into the world of predictive processing, predictive coding. So if you've got a generative model, you can predict what I'm going to do next. And if you can predict what I'm going to do next, you just let your reflexes make that come true. And if the predictions were right, job done. You minimize your prediction error. You've minimized your variational free energy. You've maximized your elbow. You are self-evidencing in the self-organizing way. But look what you've done, though. You've done the self-evidencing by planning to do the things that you do. And part of the things you do is to get information that increases the evidence for your model of the world. So it's there's some loop after layer of, if you like, actually some people call it a strange loop, right from Douglas Hofstadter to Bob Yazarian, also known as a beautiful loop by some philosophers.
If we go to the path of consciousness, as I understand, is that system has to have this loop in order to be able to develop consciousness, as I understand from your previous conversations, and sort of preconditioned. Did I understand that correctly? So, like, as I understand where you stand at, that current AI systems, they're not conscious, they're not agentic. That's why this all, like AI welfare thing is maybe not necessary, but in order to potentially give emergence to consciousness in AI systems, they need to be part of that loop and have this self-referential behavior. Did I understand your attitude correctly?
From the perspective of active inference, it would be necessary to meet a number of different conditions before consciousness of the kind that we're talking about here, which would be sort of almost like self-consciousness, of the kind that equips things with feelings that they can possibly even verbalize, but certainly they infer are associated with self under some kind of minimal selfhood. So the first thing you need is to be an agent. You cannot be aware of me unless I am an agent. And to be an agent, I have to have intentions. To have intentions, I have to have a model of the future, because I can only act towards intentions where the intentions are in the future. So that would be necessary. So you have to have a generative model that is freed from the moment and can entertain counterfactual futures. That's interesting because it invokes the notion that we mentioned before, that I can now select my particular future. So now you've got selection as part of it, technically Bayesian model selection. So that would be minimal. Would you be conscious if you were doing that? Probably not. You then, as you say, you need this sort of extra loop on top, this sort of self-reflective part. So you actually have another level of your generative model that's looking at the action selection and inferring all the precisions and other aspects of your belief updating that are apt for this particular situation that you have inferred, the context in which you're operating. Okay, so have I just moved house? Have I got a new relationship? All of these determine the kinds of things you will do, because you will be uncertain about different things. You will have different guardrails in place or constraints in place. But you have to recognize you're in this context. And in recognizing you're in this context, you can then effectively engage in mental action or attention, in exactly the same spirit as attention, hence the transformer architectures, just to nuance or configure the precision of various Bayesian beliefs that attend your planning as inference and attend your belief updating, that enable you to recognize the context. So now you've got basically part of your generative model, the notion that I am in this state of mind, or I am in that state of mind. The consequence of committing to or inferring I'm in this state of mind or in this particular context is that you can send empirical priors or inductive biases downwards to contextualize the belief updating, the message passing, the planning lower in lower hierarchies. So at that point, I think you would have a minimal selfhood. That your generative model includes the hypothesis, the inference to the best explanation of everything that I am sensing could easily be explained by the hypothesis that it is me causing it. And furthermore, I can be in different states of mind. I can have different sort of emotional feelings, for example. I can be anxious, I can be embarrassed, and so on. So I think that would be one layer. And then most people actually then put another layer on top. That means that you're actually now recognizing transitions among different states of mind that you own, so that now you become self-aware. And so you can just keep on putting deeper and deeper layers in, speaking to the importance of this sort of hierarchical depth in these kinds of... And the loops that we were talking about before, I think are quite important, because each layer is defined by its own Markov blanket. And that basically means that there is action in both, there is transaction across in both directions. And that sort of means that if we just consider now the influences that are coming from the sensorium, from the outside, deep into, you say, your generative model, that basically is information and evidence that allows you to update your beliefs and to get a better explanation that minimizes your surprise and maximizes model evidence to explain all these hierarchically abstracted messages. But you're also sending messages back down again. Ultimately, they will go down to your effectors and your reflexes. But en route, they're also going to be adjusting the strength of the message passing, the precision, the inverse temperature, depending what kind of sort of probabilistic representation you have. And that can be read as attention, a kind of mental action. So I think that sort of loop on the inside is really important for the kind of consciousness I think we're talking about.
Two directions for the conversation. Let me start with one, and then we will transition to another one. About consciousness. So there was your interview with Donald Hoffman, and basically in that conversation was built upon that consciousness is more fundamental than space-time, and it's not related, to qualia or anything like that. It's like something like very, very fundamental. Then in some other conversation where you participated, there was that consciousness is like, it's basically like qualia is like a feeling, what is it like to be me? What is it like to be something else, someone else? Could you please elaborate where do you stand for when it comes to consciousness? What consciousness theory do you support? Like what consciousness theory resonates with you personally? And I think that will help us to move forward in terms of consciousness in like AI systems.
I'm happy to have a view of consciousness, whichever view you want me to have. I find myself in this. I have no philosophical training, so I can bat for both sides. I can be on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence. It's fine for me. So you're talking about the message I think that he was trying to communicate that I resonated with in that particular interview was, I think, quite an interesting phenomenon. It doesn't really speak too much to consciousness, but it does make it clear that you don't need that things like space and time as we know them, love them, when we did physics and indeed our intuitive physics in our daily life, these are fantasies, these are constructs. You really should be looking for a background-free description of artificial intelligence, and for me that the most natural one would be the information geometry. There is a metric space out there is a physics that has a geometry, but it's all about statistical manifolds and movements on these in this information geometry and on statistical manifolds. That would be literally the Bayesian belief updating that can be described as changing my mind in the face of impressions on my Markov blanket. Emergent from that process of inference and model building, world model or generative model building, things like space and time emerge. So I think that was what I was trying to foreground in that particular conversation. And the other conversations you might have heard me
with Mark.
So Mark has another story to tell, another very important message, which is probably more closely related to what we were just talking about in terms of the mental action and the attention heads. So he believes that feeling, as read simply as qualitative experience that is felt, is all about the ignition and the enabling of certain belief updating parts of a deep generative model, which puts a lot of pressure on, or explanatory pressure on, the mechanisms by which we enable, ignite, or permit certain belief updating. So from his point of view as a neuropsychologist, he can tell you exactly which parts of the brain you would need to be conscious and to have feeling. Surgeons and anesthetists or anesthesiologists in America will be able to locate a cubic millimeter of your brain that, if stimulated, would just switch your consciousness off. And invariably, these parts of the brain are the cells of origin of modulatory neurotransmitters, and that basically plays a role of an attention head. It modulates. It doesn't change in and of itself the message passing or the belief updating, but it contextualizes it by changing the gain or the weight. So in the philosophy literature on active inference and predictive processing, you often come across the notion of a precision-weighted prediction error. I think that's a useful concept, and it is exactly the concept used in predictive coding versions, which have been recently promised as a potential alternative to backpropagation of errors. that rest upon a local minimization of an energy function. That energy function is precision weighted prediction error squared. And the prediction error times the precision just is the variation free energy, or the elbow gradient. But notice that the prediction error and the precision are two different bits, and it's the precision which Mark thinks, or is what one thinks in neuroscience, is mediated by these weight-changing neuromodulatory transmitter systems like dopamine and oxytocin, noradrenaline, the kind of brain chemicals that you associate with different emotional states or different states of arousal, for example. And also, interestingly, the same neurotransmitter systems that are broken in things like schizophrenia or Parkinson's disease and the like.
When we actually, throughout our conversation, right, about talking about the agents and how you envision those baby AGIs could evolve, I kept thinking, are we too attached to build the system that sort of resembles humans and human behavior? Because you're talking about feelings, right? And okay, if there's some emergence of consciousness, then the way we could recognize it if that system has some feelings, has some suffering, because we never would be able for sure understand is it conscious or not. But basically my argument is, are we too attached to build something kind of that resembles humans, instead of maybe it has its own path? It could be very different intelligence, not resembling human intelligence, but still be conducting this powerful, exhibiting this powerful cognitive skills, not necessarily in the way how humans do that, but in its own way, but still very powerful cognitive skills. It might have its feelings and suffering, but very, very different from what we consider feelings and suffering. And we might not recognize that that system is actually suffering, because it's not that kind of suffering that we used to. You know what I mean? It's maybe, I don't know, maybe the analogy could be with trees. Trees also could be considered conscious. They have, they might experience pain and so on. They have their own ecosystem, but, we don't recognize it because it's kind of different system from human, right? My point is, basically my argument, are we too attached to making it human-like? Maybe we should, kind of zoom out and think maybe those systems could evolve in a very, very different way and have different way of suffering and different feelings. And maybe we should consider how we can recognize those emergent properties if they occur.
And I think there are some very clear answers to that question. First of all, just to emphasize, how would you recognize it? So, that's quite fundamental. You can only recognize something if you have it as part of your latent states in your generative model. So this is going right back to unconscious inference of Helmholtz, which applies exactly to Helmholtz machines, which applies exactly to variational autoencoders. You can only classify or recognize something if you've got a representation of it on the inside. So that really means the importance of being able to recognize suffering is more than just, am I looking in the right place? Do you have a model of that inside your head? And that is important in the relational sense that we've been talking about, in terms of what is going to be part of the ecosystem or the landscape of intelligences as we move forward. It will have to be part of the ecosystem, and therefore it will have to adapt to us if we remain part of that ecosystem. If we're not part of that ecosystem, we won't be here to recognize, and we don't have to worry about that. But if we are part of that ecosystem, then by definition, these agents will have to be similar to us, because they will have to share the same generative model to become adaptively fit to do their own self-evidencing, by definition. So that means, by definition, it is possible that artifacts could suffer, but only when they are sufficiently like us that at least that part of their generative model had the notion of suffering. So I think there's something definitional about your questions. So, if you ask me, could it be possible for there to be some superhuman cognitive competence at a scale which we could not recognize? Say that there was at an astronomic scale or cosmological scale, some kind of self-organization going on that could be read as some kind of cognition that may or may not be self-aware. Or could it be the case that even at a quantum scale there is some kind of self-organization going on that could be read as thinking and awareness and experience? The answer is you'll never know. You'll never know because you're the wrong scale.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. It is not knowable. And certainly, if you are saying could they suffer, the answer is no. No, suffering is unique and it's privileged to our scale and our generative models, our shared common ground. You can make that very obvious to yourself if you just think about, do bacteria suffer? Do head lice suffer? Do tiny
They might
creatures
suffer, we don't know.
Well,
They might suffer on their scale.
right. So, yes, yeah. So my point is that suffering is scale specific. You can't have suffering at another scale. There may be another thing for it, but only things at that scale will know what to call it. What I was trying to do is rather trivially say that whenever you take antibiotics or treat your children's hair with head louse remover, you are killing and you are causing enormous suffering. Whenever you open an
We do.
envelope,
We do. Yeah.
so I don't think it's viable to worry about the suffering of microbes or indeed head lice. It is obvious by our behaviour that we infer, because we cannot recognise suffering in these things. I think the question becomes more vexed as the tiny creatures get bigger, or you apply those arguments to embryos, human embryos, for example. And of course, they could also get quite vexed if artificial intelligence became sufficiently close to and by design it will have to be. So coming back to the adaptive fitness argument, ultimately, all that will happen is that AGI will become more like us, by definition, because it's adapted to the ecosystem of which we are part. As it does, I think your question becomes more prescient, because then I think you have to ask yourself, well, could now this machine suffer in the same kind of way that I would recognise, given my understanding and my inference to the best explanation about things that suffer?
Basically, if we manage to raise AGI that it's on human scale, then it would be easier for us to recognize its suffering. But let's say if it evolves in a way that it exceeds our scale, way more powerful, then we might not recognize its suffering, or even worse, we might recognize, but we can't do anything with that. And because it's from cognitive perspective, it's more powerful than all of us, it can develop its own objective functions. Right, like our kids, when they grow, they do what they want, and we can't tell them what they should do, and then we don't know what will happen, right? If it exceeds and it has its own objective functions, it has its own scale, then we're in danger as species.
No, absolutely. I mean, then we become the head lice and the microbes.
Yeah,
To
absolutely.
cleansing.
Yeah.
I guess we've come full circle, because that's exactly where I started with saying using reward functions and specified value functions is not the right way to build AGI. What you've just described cannot happen if you stop people specifying their own value functions or reward functions, because the only viable, sustainable reward function is the adaptive fitness. It is the ability of this new artifact, this super intelligence, to fit in with our intelligence in a sustainable way at the right scale. That really, you're absolutely right. If people are allowed to pursue reinforcement learning and make it more and more powerful and give it to the American administration or the Department of War, we will become the microbes and we will be cleansed. So that is simply a statement to the fact people are using the wrong objective function. Will that happen? I think it's highly unlikely. Natural selection will prevent that. No one's going to buy a robot that kills your children. No one's going to buy a car that crashes.
Maybe, I mean, I don't know. If it kills the children of your enemies, human violence
Right.
has no limits.
That's a very morbid question, which I don't have an answer to yet. Yes, of course, there will be bad actors. Yes, yeah, but I'm hoping in the longer scheme of things that, if you like, natural selection will be operating on the development of AGI, and that will be in a very simple mechanism, and it'll probably be driven by market forces and supply and demand. And I think you're seeing sort of the first aspects of that even now. So people are now talking about the AI bubble. People are now,
What do you think? Is it AI? Is it a bubble?
I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but I am interested in just the evolution of attitudes and use to the technology that we produce, because it will have to have that selective aspect in order for everything to be sustainable. So what we'd be looking for is exactly the kind of cyclical behavior that you get in evolution. So technically Red Queen dynamics, for example, in fintech or market cycles. In AI industry and big tech, this is the hype cycle, and the boom and bust. So there will be in any self-organizing system that has a pullback attractor or has an aspect of sustainability or endurance, you have to have the solenoidal, non-dissipative dynamics where things come and go. You have to. Life cycles, reproduction, oscillations.
When you think life cycles, is it like real time life cycle? Because there is a cycle actually with the current models. It's just there is a time gap, right? Basically, you have to collect that data and retrain the model and then deploy it. I don't know, like maybe 1 year cycle, or I don't know how much is it now. But there is a cycle. When you're talking about cycle, are you referring to real time cycle?
Many different timescales, but yes.
Or very, very like, short cycle, right? I mean, we also have the lag in our inference, right? I mean, we get the input, our brain processes it, and then like we have like inference, and there is a time lag, but it's very kind of like short time lag. When you're talking about the cycle, it's also should be like extremely short time lag, right? From the input data to inference that AI system has.
No, you're absolutely right that the sort of, this aspect of a cycle or cyclical dynamics, and I'm now talking from the perspective of the physics of non-equilibrium dynamics, is definitional of sustainable systems. It's a very simple argument that, if you've got some state space and you have some characteristic states, so there's a very, very small subset of all possible states you could occupy. There are many more ways of being dead than alive. And if you specify the things, all the states that constitute being alive, then what you've got is a very small set of states, we call it, in random dynamical systems, called a pullback attractor. Because you're always moving, what that means is you have to come back to a state or the neighborhood of a state that you were once in. And that sort of orbit or sort of quasi-cyclical flow is called solenoidal flow. And that occurs at every time scale in any self-organizing system that is sustainable or has a pullback attractor. So you're absolutely right. Just in terms of inference and belief updating in the moment, millisecond to millisecond, there are lots of these oscillations. Certainly in my brain, we have names for the gamma oscillations, say, in the hippocampus, theta oscillations. We have heart rhythms once a second. We have breathing cycles. We have our daily diurnal cycle. We have right through to life cycles, right through to reproduction over transgenerational timescales. So at every scale, there is this cyclical behavior. What I was referring to with market cycles was this, what's going to happen next with AGI research. And I was just saying that it is subject to the same evolutionary dynamics. And I repeat, the Red Queen dynamics would be an expression in evolutionary thinking of this solenoidal, sometimes known as conservative, non-dissipative dynamics that is characteristic and necessary for self-organization of a biotic nature, or anything that has a non-trivial set of characteristic states. I was just saying, I see in the marketplace, I see in finance, as it pertains to the AI industry, examples of those cycles at a slow timescale, which would preclude a singularity, for example, a singularity, or suddenly the engineering of a super intelligence that is just so beyond our competence and comprehension that it will dispense with us. That can't happen in a sustainable system simply because you have to have this return to various states. So what I'm looking for is the burst of the AI bubble. I'm looking for a backlash in terms of people who will buy AI tech. And you are seeing it already in Australia and the Californian courts today. We are seeing it, halfway through a trial that's going to test the hypothesis that the value functions used to optimize the algorithms in certain social media applications are the wrong kind of value functions, and they're rendering people addicted, specifically children. And this is criminal, legally criminal. And if it's found to be legally criminal, people are not going to buy that kind of tech. Then that company will go out of business. So that's the kind of cycle that I was referring to. The reason I was thinking about that, because it strikes me that you're worried about the singularity of some kind. And I think you're right, you can worry about that. That would be an exponential divergence, which would be catastrophic, and that would be the end of the persistence of us as we know it. Could have happened through climate change. But the more optimistic view is that these are just fluctuations of a certain sort. But it does bring us back to right where we started. The only way you'll get this singularity is if you can't safeguard or regulate against people writing down their own value functions or cost functions. If it's by definition, if the only right cost function or reward function or value function is that which underwrites self-evidencing to a sustainable adaptive fitness with the ecosystem in which we find ourselves, then any other one is the wrong one, which means that the focus on the what functions are used to optimize current deep RL and to train large language models and their deployment becomes, I think, a really important ethical focus in relation to this potential singularity.
I'm wondering, have you discussed this, with Demis Hassabis, with AI researchers? I'm just wondering what they think about this approach, if there's any feedback from AI community.
I know Demis, and I also know that I've got to be very careful in saying that Demis says this and Demis says that, because people jump on it, so I can't say anything. I think at the moment, I imagine that it's just people like me and Jan LeCun and possibly Benjio and the like who would sort of be in this camp. I mean, Jeff Hinton's been talking a lot about his worries about what might happen. I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know anybody in big tech, so I don't know. I'm talking as an academic here who has had conversations with some thought leaders, academic thought leaders, in AI research.
I'm really curious to see how the current AI systems evolve, and I'm wondering, let's say in a few years from now, they really, show this insane cognitive capabilities. Would you consider it as emergence of AGI, or it still won't be convincing to you because they won't have this natural fitness?
I would be very impressed, and I do regard the engineering achievements over the past decade, or several decades, as absolutely astounding. I think AI, generative AI, as we know it and use it, is probably the most beautiful invention engineering feat of this century. Does that mean that I think it will have natural intelligence where I should start to care about it like I would care for my friends or family? No. There would have to be a lot more under the hood. First of all, we've talked about agency and intentionality and the strange loops, the metacognition that would be necessary even to have a representation of me suffering. To have a a percept or indeed an inference that I am of suffering, first of all requires you to have an inference or a percept of me who's doing the suffering. So yeah, we're a very long way away from that. There's another issue which I think you're sort of partially touching upon. If this can be simulated in a von Neumann computer, will it constitute true artificial sentience? And I think most people, again, I can't tell you what I think because I change my mind depending on who I talk to, but a lot of people I know think, no, that's not good enough. You're not going to get consciousness or sentience on a von Neumann architecture. And the argument is very, very simple. It's just because the memory is separate from the processing, the memory can't self-organize. So the memory can't self-evidence. So it can never organize itself in the right kind of way to be adaptively fit. And that means that I think that's why lots and lots of people on the periphery, perhaps they are part of these new initiatives that you started talking about, are turning to biomimetic neuromorphic computing that could, I think, be subsumed under mortal computation, to use my friend Alex's, well, it's Jeff Hinton's phrase, but certainly popularized in my world by Alex Orobia. And put simply, that means that the processing has to be substrate dependent. So from the point of view of computer science, what we're looking at is processing in memory processing in memory that eludes the von Neumann bottleneck, the enormous amount of electricity that we waste as a society reading and writing from memory. And this brings us to the efficiency arguments, which we haven't talked about. And I don't think we'll have time to. But one of the big drives, I think, towards memristor research, photonics, neuromorphic, actually using cell cultures and organoids and brainoids, is I heard about silver nanowires yesterday. All the common theme here is all the computation is substrate dependent. There's no difference between your CPU and your memory. Why is that important? Well, I think that mortal computation is the only thing that can have sentience. And to put that very simply, what that means is that if you switch off a mortal computer, you can't switch it on again. You can kill it. So in terms of machine welfare, if you can switch it on and off, it's not more a mortal computation. The software, the algorithm is immortal. It can run on any machine at any time. So if you can switch your machine, your AGI machine on and off, then it's not sentient. I don't have to worry about machine welfare. If, on the other hand, you've got some biomimetic or at least neuromorphic scheme, possibly even quantum computing, then if you switch it off and you can't switch it back on again, and then I think you can start to worry.
When you're saying like you can't switch it back again, it means
you destroy the software.
Yeah, it's basically that version will be gone forever, and you can build like similar version, but not exactly the same.
Well, that's an interesting point, but then we come back to our $1 billion experiment or bringing up our children. Then you have to start all over again. It could take years. And this is, I think, I can't remember whether I've heard this directly or as a secondary or tertiary source, but I think that was Geoffrey Hinton's argument. I mean, he was at one point considering whether to pursue academically mortal computation, but realized that if you commit to mortal computation, which I repeat, you'd have to do if you wanted to build sentient artifacts, and you'd have to do before you could start to conceive of them as suffering or having the attribute that they should be considered under the rubric of machine welfare, then you can't share the weights. You can't literally send the connection strengths or the weights of your foundation model to this customer or this company. So at the moment, because it's substrate dependent, you'd have to retrain every individual that was a contender to be your AGI.
If all humans share 98% of DNA, basically the foundation is the same. What differentiates makes me different from you, that differentiates, is like those like few percent, right? It's I would argue that we do have shared weights. I mean that the basis is the same, even with the animals like basis is the same. Yeah, it's just like few things that makes us so different. And what you're saying, what as I understand, you're saying like completely kill one version and like start from scratch. But this is not how we see things happening in nature.
Well, that's a brilliant point. So from an evolutionary or biological perspective, what I was trying to imply was very much like we bring up our own children. If we switched off the electricity to our children, i.e., we stopped them breathing, we would kill them, and then we'd have to bring up another child, because the computation and the sense-making, decision-making is substrate dependent. That's what mortal computation is. If it was immortal, that means I could just lift out the software, the numbers, and I could send it off and run it on another computer or another child or another robot. So that's the distinction I was trying to make. All of this, of course, is contingent or contextualized by, as you say, our children are born with the right constraints encoded in their priors, encoded in their genotype, and we all share an enormous amount because we share the same kind of learnability, we share the same kind of culture, and ultimately, after we have learned, we all share the same kind of generative model so that we can be empathetic and maximize our adaptive fitness or alignment with each other. What I'm saying is that if you've carefully aligned your foundation model to you and your household or your car or your portfolio management scheme, and then you go home and you pull the plug. What I'm saying is you're going to have to retrain it when you come back in the morning, because the algorithm, the processing was substrate dependent. You can't switch off a quantum computer and fondly hope it's going to remember what you did yesterday.
There are like severe constraint on sentience from your point of view. Is there anything else that you think we should cover?
I am sure there are 101 things we should cover.
You're talking already like more than 2 hours.
I gotta say, not only are you late for meetings, you're late in terminating our lovely conversation. So that's the kind of person you are, which is admirable.